Welcome, everybody, to The Untold Story. I'm Martha McCallum, and one of the things that we love to do on this podcast is help our viewers get to know people that they see on TV a lot, but maybe they don't know that much about the person and their background and how they got to where they are. So I'm really thrilled today to be joined by Karoline Leavitt. Karoline was a very prominent part of the Trump campaign and worked as the national press secretary on the campaign. She also ran for Congress back in New Hampshire, where she is from, as a very young woman, and she served as the White House assistant press secretary under Kayleigh McEnany, who we all know really well and love. And so I just want to welcome Karoline Leavitt to The Untold Story. Hey, how you doing?
Hey, Martha, I'm doing great. Thanks so much for having me on your podcast.
So I'm always impressed by women who are accomplished and making a name for themselves, especially at such a young age. And you, Karoline, let's just give everybody a little bit of a peel back. Tell everyone, who you are. If you're comfortable saying how old you are, that's great. And, you have a family. You have a lot going on in your life. And tell us about Karoline Leavitt.
Yeah, I sure do. It's been a very busy time, especially over the past year. I gave birth to my first child in July in the midst of a presidential campaign working as the national press secretary. Prior to that, I don't know how you did that.
I don't know how you did that, but it's very impressive. I was like, wait a minute, she had a baby in the middle of the campaign last summer? So go ahead.
Yeah, so thank you. It's been one of the most challenging times of my life, but very rewarding, and obviously all of the hard work very much paid off. Before that, I ran for Congress. I was the youngest female to ever run for Congress and win a nomination. I fell short in the general election, but obviously God had another plan, and that led me to working for President Trump on his campaign. And then prior to that, I was in Washington, D.C. I worked in the White House, as you mentioned. I also worked on Capitol Hill as the communications director for Congresswoman Elise Stefanik, and I didn't grow up in a political family. I grew up, like most Americans, in a middle-class business family here in my home state of New Hampshire, and then I just dove into politics at my college, St. Anselm College in Manchester, which you know well. Yep. Fox News camps out there every 4 years for the primary, and that's really where it began.
Oh, it's so interesting. I remember being at St. Anselm's College in 2016, and it was a snowy day, and now President-elect Trump, but at the time he was the nominee for the 2016 race, came over to our Fox News headquarters on campus and did an interview with me there. And it's just a long road. I bet, were you there then? Were you there at that time?
I was actually a student at the time, and I, again, wasn't involved in politics. My dad used to watch Bill O'Reilly when I was growing up, and I was always enthralled with the news and what was going on in the world. But when I got to college, I realized I was conservative, and I thought differently than a lot of my fellow students. So when the primary happened and our campus really turned into a hub for national news, as one of the lone conservatives on campus, they actually appointed me to be just an assistant running around on campus that week for Fox News. So I was just running around backstage, and that was when I decided this is what I wanted to do with my career.
Yeah, well, that's a lot. You were probably about 21 when you graduated from college. So in 6 years, you've worked at the White House, become the national press secretary on the president's campaign, and had been married and had a baby. What was that like for you this summer? And how did the campaign handle you in such a forward-facing position on air, having your baby? I don't even know how many weeks you took off. It felt like you didn't disappear at all.
No, I took off 9 days between giving birth and being back on TV. And it was incredibly challenging. I had learned my husband and I were expecting our beautiful son just a few weeks before Susie Wiles and Chris LaCivita called to offer me the position. And I disclosed to them in good faith and said, look, my doctor, my parents, and my husband are the only people in the world who know I'm pregnant, but I feel I need to, reveal this to you since this is such a public-facing position. And they didn't blink. They were so incredibly supportive, congratulating me and told me, we will make this work as long as, you can have appropriate childcare to get back to work before the election. And I said, absolutely, I can do that. And thankfully, I have a great support system. It takes a village. My mother, my husband, my father, my brothers, my sister-in-laws have all really chipped in to help me over these last several weeks. But it was tough. I was pregnant in a courthouse with President Trump in Manhattan throughout the entire trial, flying on planes all over the country, going to rallies courtside at UFC fights, up until I was about 36 weeks pregnant, and then decided it was time to hunker down, and then returned right back to work after having my son.
And what did President Trump have to say to you through all that about it?
Well, it was months until he actually said anything. He knew that I was pregnant when I took the job, but it wasn't until I was really starting to show, which took a while since it was my first baby, until he had said, I don't even know you're pregnant because you just work so hard and you still look so beautiful. So he was always very supportive of it and kind. And when I returned, he's, always asking me, how are you doing and feeling? Actually, a week after I gave birth to my son, it was the week of the Republican convention. Unfortunately, I had to miss that, which was upsetting, but of course bittersweet. But the president took time out of that crazy week for him. It was obviously also days after the assassination attempt, and he called me, and Mrs. Trump was on the phone, and they checked in and asked how the baby was. And this is a man who almost just lost his life, and he was concerned about my well-being and the well-being of my child. And I will never forget that phone conversation. And I think despite popular belief, contrary to popular belief, the president is incredibly supportive and empowering to young women and working mothers like myself.
Well, there's so many women in high-level positions around President-elect Trump, and it's hard to get his title straight sometimes because he was president nominee, president-elect. So now we're president-elect and soon to be president again. You mentioned Susie Wild. I thought it was very interesting and funny that when she was introduced on election night, President Trump referred to her as the Ice Maiden. Why did he call her that?
I think it's an accurate description. Look, Susie is a grandmother and a sweetheart and incredibly understanding. But if you cross her, you're going to know. Unfortunately, I have not yet. I have never gotten her wrath, but I know other people who have. And that's what makes her a great leader, is she's incredibly just inspiring to work for. And you know that you just need to get your job done and you need to execute on your responsibilities. And if you don't, she's going to be the first to call you out. She led such an incredible team of professionals. This was truly the most disciplined campaign President Trump ever had. I say that humbly since I was a part of it, but there were truly minimal leaks. We had a great staff, a great camaraderie until the very end, and I credit much of that to Susie Wiles and her leadership.
I mean, it was so full of drama this last year. You just mentioned when you talked about all of the places you went that you were in courthouses quite a bit. And I think back to those mini press conferences that President Trump would do in the hallway. I went down and sat in the courtroom a few times during the New York cases. What did Susie Wiles, Chris LaCivita say to you guys back at that point when there must have been moments where you thought, this is pretty weighty?
Ultimately, the direction always came from President Trump, but Susie and Chris certainly were the steady hand in a very stormy ocean for our ship that was sailing and trying to make it to our destination throughout the entire campaign. And they were always just reminding us that we were working for the hardest working candidate in politics. And that really is true. You look at how hard President Trump worked throughout this campaign, even in the face of so much adversity, from the trials to heinous assassination attempts on his life, the changing of candidates. I mean, when we started the campaign, when I began during the primary, we were still fending off folks like Ron DeSantis and Nikki Haley, very legitimate Republican contenders. Then we become the nominee. We're facing Biden. And then next thing you know, we're facing Kamala Harris. So we ran multiple campaigns throughout the duration of a year. And we just took our direction and our leadership from President Trump. And then, of course, also Susie and Chris, who just reminded us we have to stay focused, stay disciplined, and keep working. And if you win the day, you'll win the week, then you win the month. And then next thing you know, you win the election. And that's exactly what happened for us.
I think that's a great way of putting it, and I think that it shows the discipline of this team. How would you describe in terms of, because most people at home didn't get to see the leadership of the campaign, and obviously, as you say, and as I know from having covered President Trump all these years, he is very much the hands-on decision maker for all of these things. But you, as you point out, had Chris LaCivita, a Marine and a campaign veteran, and Susie Wiles, who in her career worked for Kemp and Reagan and DeSantis and Trump. How would you describe the different roles that they played as leadership in the campaign?
Well, they definitely have different personalities. That's not a secret. As you said, Chris is a hard-charging Marine who definitely lets you know when he's upset with you, or vice versa, right? He wears his emotions on his sleeve. And Susie, I would say, is also, again, that same way, trusts people to get the job done. But they were a great team and working together, and they just led us through every day. And I would say Chris, since I was part of the communications team, we leaned on him when it came to negative stories in the press, how we were going to fight back, how we were going to push back. Susie may have spent a little bit more time focusing on personnel and on strategy, but both of them were always there and always accessible. I can say, working for them, whenever you call, they pick right up or they call you back. And I think that's what the testament to a true leader is. You're responsive to your staff and you're giving them answers and giving them the truth. That's something I also very much appreciate about both of them, especially having worked on the communications team. Sometimes you hear reports that you actually don't know are true or not, and you have to go to the leadership on the campaign to figure out what's true, what's real, what should we fight back on. And they were always there to give us that honest information, and then allowed us as communications team. I have to give a shout out to my colleagues, Jason Miller and Stephen Chung, who are fantastic communicators. And we would be able to make those decisions on our own. And Susie and Chris really gave us that deference and trusted us to do our jobs.
Mm-hmm. The Untold Story continues right after this.
Yeah, I think that's a really good explanation of what good leaders do in a campaign environment or in a White House environment or, frankly, in a business environment. These polls, the final result was, 3.5 points apart. And they kept saying it was, right on a knife's edge, neck and neck the whole time. What was that like for you inside the campaign? Did you have moments where you thought, well, we might lose this thing?
There were moments certainly where I felt as though it was moving in the wrong direction, or the media was giving us such a hard time that sometimes it's difficult to break out of that echo chamber that we live in the mainstream press, working with them every day, battling, a lot of fake news reporters. I hate to call them that, but it's true. There are a lot of journalists who aren't truly interested in journalism anymore, unfortunately, and we dealt with them every day. So sometimes it was difficult to see through that and then realize that there were millions and millions of Americans who were supportive of President Trump. And I think every time we did go to a rally or went out into the country, I was with President Trump when we went to the bodega in Harlem or the construction stop in the middle of Manhattan with union workers. Those were the moments where I always knew we were going to win, because when you broke out of the Washington, D.C. and the mainstream media echo chamber and really listened to what average everyday Americans cared about, it was the issues that President Trump led on. And our internal polling throughout the campaign was always very positive, moving in the right direction. Towards the end, our internal polling showed we were going to win every battleground state. It was incredibly accurate. Shout out to our pollster, Tony Fabrizio, whose numbers were spot on. So I think heading into Tuesday, we were very confident, truly, that we were going to win. But there's always a cautious optimism, especially in Trump world, where we know our people don't always trust the polls and pick up the phone. So you don't know how accurate the data is, but it turned out our data was spot on.
Yeah, it's so interesting. A couple of times I had an opportunity to speak to President Trump and, asked him, what do you think about these polls? They're showing this huge gender gap. What are you going to do to fix this? And he kept saying, well, I don't know, but our polls look great. And for everyone in the press and in the public, there are polls that aren't shared with people. And, I just find it so interesting because I don't know that pollsters, I think they lost credibility again. this time around? Because I remember Britt Hume saying just a couple weeks ago that in the old days when you covered campaigns, there weren't all these polls. So you had to base it on the feeling that you saw at campaign events, at large events, the momentum that you sensed on the ground when you went from one place to another, how big were the groups that were showing up to see each one of these candidates. And that's where you started to draw your conclusions. And then either the polls would substantiate that or they would deviate from it, depending on, and that's how you kind of formulated your take as a journalist of what was actually going on the ground. So I think it's interesting. So with regard to that, does anything stand out to you? You talk about talking to construction workers and going to the bodega. Are there a couple of moments that are indelible in your mind of an exchange that you watched the president have, or something that made you say, this is the heart of the matter?
Yeah, it was the migrant crime and the victims of migrant crime that unfortunately our campaign got to know, and because their loved ones were killed at the hands of illegal migrants who should have never been in this country in the first place. You know, the mother of Rachel Morin, Patty Morin, who ultimately turned out to be a surrogate for us. She wanted to be so deeply involved. The president got to know her very well. He had private lunches with her that were never even reported by the press. He does this because he truly cares about people and felt sorry for the way their lives were forever ruined. And I think as a new mother, that really tore at my heart, watching some of these moments behind the scenes, and the unimaginable loss of a parent whose child was taken from them. You know, Jocelyn Nungary's mother, Alexis, who her 12-year-old daughter was ripped from her. So strong, and the way she would speak so eloquently with strength and class and grace was so inspiring. And I was backstage at the rally in Georgia when President Trump embraced Laken Riley's mother just days after her death, and I will never forget that moment, seeing that mother who just needed a little bit of hope. And I think President Trump, acknowledging the death of her daughter and promising to fix it, gave her that hope she needed in that moment. And I mean, I get chills thinking about these experiences I've had with President Trump, and I know that's what he thinks about when he wants to lead this country. And we will not forget those families when he is back in the White House. I can tell you that. That's the reason he ran this campaign. And I think it's a huge reason he won, because Americans were so sick and tired of waking up to headlines about our fellow citizens being raped and killed at the hands of people who should never be here in the first place. It was a huge problem for the Harris-Biden campaign that they never fully or adequately addressed. They ignored the problem. They underestimated how much it was impacting everyday Americans. President Trump didn't. He heard their concerns and their stories, and he was there for them. And I will never forget those moments.
Yeah, I think that our drones over the border all those years ago started to give people a sense of what was actually happening there. And I do think that you're right. When you look at it, the issue was just ignored at the White House as if it would go away if you got to see Lady Gaga perform, or you wouldn't care about it suddenly if you saw a sort of heartfelt conversation with Oprah. And I think that these celebrity moments really were overshadowed by people's actual feelings out there. And I think it has been just a very revealing campaign season to watch all this unfold. You know, I want to get your thoughts on the transition and what it looks like going forward. Having been there last time to this time, what's different?
Well, it's moving quite quickly. President Trump this time around, as he said, understands D.C., knows the good players, knows the bad players. When he went there in 2016, he was a New York guy. He had only been to Washington a handful of times in his life. And so he had to lean on the opinions of people who he hardly knew. Now he knows everyone in the game of politics. He knows who's loyal to him, but most of all, who's loyal to the America First agenda, which he just received a resounding mandate to govern on. So we already have some fantastic picks. Congresswoman Elise Stefanik, my former boss, as the ambassador to the UN. You have Congressman Mike Waltz, who will be serving as National Security Advisor. You just saw Governor Huckabee, former Governor Huckabee, will now be the ambassador to Israel. Susie Wiles, of course, will be serving as the first female chief of staff. There will be many more exciting announcements to come, and they're all going to be people who I think are well respected, well liked, of course, by Republicans, but I think independents in this country too. And I know that the president is thinking about who will serve the American people best and who will advance the America First agenda, because that's what he campaigned on and that's what the American people elected him on.
What is your job right now, Karoline, and what do you think it will be going forward?
Well, currently I'm the transition spokeswoman for the transition. I have not been offered a position in the White House yet. I will see what happens. Obviously, I would love to go back to the White House and work. It's such an amazing place to work. I'll never forget, walking in there to work every day and looking at the tourists, looking through the gates, wondering, how they could get inside. It's such an honor and a privilege. And so we'll see. It's up to President Trump.
So is that, when you look at, say, Karine Jean-Pierre doing her job and you look at all the people who have been at that podium before, what are your thoughts? And you worked with Kayleigh McEnany, who did a great job at it. Is that something that you would like to do? Is that a position that you seek?
Of course, but ultimately it's a decision for President Trump to make, and I will respect whatever he decides.
Understood. And do you expect that the rest of the communications team, Stephen Chung, Jason Miller, do they all anticipate continuing on in this second term from the comms group?
Yeah, I don't want to speak on behalf of my colleagues, but I know many of them are interested in returning to the White House. Many of them have served them before. We had, again, a phenomenal campaign team, and not just the names you mentioned, but so many amazing junior staffers, too, who worked behind the scenes every day, diligently, very hardworking, young people who want to make this country great again and believed in President Trump. So I know that Susie Wiles is going to take that into consideration now that she's White House Chief of Staff, and making sure those that are loyal and hardworking on behalf of President Trump will find their places in the administration.
You say that you realized in college that you were conservative. What made you realize that?
Well, I came from a small business family, and I know that I always believed in limited government. I had a respect for our nation's history. I was always enthralled with it, even as a young girl. And so when I got to college and realized that some folks on the left, my fellow students at the time, maybe had a disdain or a bad taste in their mouth for America and our institutions and our nation's history, that didn't resonate or sit well with me. I felt as though a sense of pride to live in the greatest country in the history of the world. I didn't believe in the identity politics of the left, or that, the color of your skin or your gender or where you come from can hold you back in this country. I don't believe that's true. And so I think that was the foundation for my conservative beliefs. And then, of course, President Trump was running for president at the time, and his America First message at the time really resonated with me. I actually wrote an op-ed in the school newspaper in 2016 during the primary that said, why Donald Trump just keeps on winning and the media doesn't get it, which is funny because in 2024, that op-ed title is just as true today, I think, as it was then. And ever since, I've been supportive of the president, and then, of course, had the honor to work in his White House and on his campaign, and now we'll see what's next.
Last question for you. What feels different now, having been around President Trump all of these years, as you watch him get ready to take the presidency again?
I think he, like I said earlier, is more wise about the deep state, if you will, the establishment in Washington, D.C., and how much the lengths to which they were willing to go to derail his campaign and his success. I mean, they impeached him twice in his first term. They indicted him 4 times on baseless charges. They forced him to sit in a courthouse for 6 weeks and essentially took away his First Amendment right with an unconstitutional gag order. They've investigated his family, his business, and again, he's now survived 2 attempts on his life. So I think when you go through all those experiences, it can be quite humbling. But also in the case of President Trump, I think everyone that tried to doubt him or derail him underestimated his strength and his willingness to fight back. When he is punched, he punches back harder. And I will tell you how impressed I continue to be by this man's energy. It is insane how
incredible.
Energetic he is. And I'm a third of his age, and working for him, it was difficult to keep up.
He went, I think, 72 hours in those last days of rallies. And I had an opportunity to speak with him on the morning of the election. I couldn't believe he was awake, watching I think 3 rallies a day for the 3 days before that. It was just it's an extraordinary example of tenacity and energy that I think everybody regardless of how they feel, has to have some admiration for. Do you think that he has mellowed, and do you think he wants to bring the country together? When I say mellowed, I think that's what I'm getting at. Is there a desire to unify that feels like there will be a different tone to this presidency?
There's absolutely a desire to unify, no doubt. And it's because he's been a victim of the weaponization of our justice system. He's been a victim of political violence. And ultimately, President Trump loves this country so very much. He wants it to succeed. And as he said, and it was his line, he made it up and it's brilliant, the greatest unifier for this country is going to be success. When all Americans are making money, when everyone feels safe in their communities, when everyone feels like their child is getting a good education, when we feel like our border's secure and we're not going to be entangled in a World War III, that's when people are successful. That's when people will get along. That's when our country is going to be unified. I know he believes that to his core, and I believe that he's going to work every day when he's back in the White House to do just that, to unify the country, to bring people together through success. And it's something the last administration absolutely failed to do. Joe Biden campaigned on being the unifier in chief, and our country's never been more divided. I think President Trump is capable of it. The media needs him to give him a fair shake and credit him for the success that he's going to bring to this country. But I believe that he will.
Karoline Leavitt, a pleasure to speak with you. You are a shining example of success. You've achieved a lot already in your life, and we look forward to seeing what comes next for you. It's an exciting time for the country, and certainly exciting time for you personally and professionally. So thanks for taking a few moments to talk to us and tell us your untold story, and we look forward to seeing much more of you. Thank you, Karoline.
Awesome. Thanks, Martha.
That was Karoline Leavitt from the Trump transition team, the Trump campaign, and likely the Trump next White House. We'll see where Karoline ends up serving in her next capacity. We thank her so much for being with us. I'm Martha McCallum. Thank you for joining us today for The Untold Story. I'll see you next time. You've been listening to The Untold Story with Martha McCallum. Don't forget to subscribe on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen. Make sure to rate and review. For more podcasts, go to foxnewspodcast.com. Listen ad-free with the Fox News Podcast Plus subscription on Apple Podcasts, and Amazon Prime members can listen to this show ad-free on the Amazon Music app.